and welcome to World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, Russia, Iran, and Turkey have convened an important meeting concerning the future of Syria. What would all of these discussions mean for the country's future? Tuberculosis outbreaks in the middle school in Hunan has gripped the nation of China. How did this disease spread so rapidly? We begin our show with Syria. Russia, Iran, and Turkey have launched a major diplomatic push to end the Syrian crisis. The three countries have agreed to hold a Syrian Congress involving all parties and opposition groups. However, the opposition said it will continue to demand that the Syrian president step down.
The leaders of Russia, Turkey, and Iran have agreed to convene a Syrian People's Congress as one of the first steps to establish a dialogue in the country. Russian President Vladimir Putin hosted his Turkish and Iranian counterparts in Sochi and says they agreed to step up efforts to finish off what Putin called terrorist groups in Syria.
We have agreed to continue to apply the most active efforts for reaching our main goal of establishing peace and stability in Syria and preserving its sovereignty, unity and territorial integrity. With satisfaction, we have major success in the joint fight against terrorism.
The meeting in Sochi came on the same day as Syrian opposition groups met in Saudi Arabia. The opposition say it will continue to demand President Bashar al-Assad leave power at the start of any political transition. Turkey, which also supports the Syrian opposition, says all parties have to intensify efforts to try to settle the crisis in Syria.
The point we have reached is important, but not enough. It is critical for all concerned parties to contribute for a permanent and acceptable political solution for the people of Syria.
The trilateral talks came 2 days after Putin hosted Syria's President Bashar al-Assad in Sochi. Putin says the Syrian leadership is committed to the peace process, a constitutional reform and free elections.
Political process should become a major priority for all parties involved. So basically now they're switching attention from the military to the political process.
Syria remains divided among those loyal to Assad, the US-backed Syrian Democratic Forces and several jihadist groups. It remains to be seen if these latest efforts by Russia can breathe new life into the negotiations.
And for more on the Syrian peace process, if we could call it, we are joined in our Beijing studio Li Guofu, who is a director with the Center for Middle East Studies in the China Institute of International Studies. Sir, welcome to our program. Also in Beijing, we would like to welcome to China Mr. Yuri Tavrovsky, who is a professor at Russian People's Friendship University. We used to see you only through satellite links, and now you are here in Beijing. A big welcome to you. In Tehran, Iran, we have Professor Hamed Musawi at the University of Tehran. Professor Musawi, also very first time, welcome to our program. I want to begin with you here in Beijing, Mr. Tavrovsky. Russia has been this quite important player, bringing all sides together.
Yes.
Turkey, Iran, Russia now being the pillar for putting the process forward. And yet, how should we describe this stage?
I think they've made a very important, very big step forward.
In terms of what?
In terms of keeping Syria united, keeping Syria as a country on the map of the Middle East, and approaching some sort of peace. We think that actually a big victory was won during the past few months. We've stopped the terrorists from dismembering the country. So it's evident that Syria is now an entity, and still there are many problems, and they must be somehow solved. And the major stakeholders in this process.
Okay, one of the issues, Professor Moussaoui, coming from Iran, is the fate of the president of Syria, Mr. Assad. Now, all sides have agreed that there has to be a process.
Yes.
And yet, Professor Moussaoui, not all sides, particularly Iran and Turkey, have agreed as to what to do eventually with President Assad. What is exactly Iran's position after this round of talk?
Yes, so Iran's position has been that there should be elections and Assad should be able to run, and it should be the people of Syria who get to decide of whether they want to keep Assad or they want a new person. But Iran has said that they will not accept the removal of Assad as a precondition. As I said, they say that it should be part of the election process. Nevertheless, I think the importance and significance of these talks is twofold. First of all, there has been many talks and many negotiations before this, so why is this one important? I think the first issue is that these talks are taking place against the backdrop of a new reality in Syria. In this new reality, ISIS has been defeated. Its terrorist operations are still ongoing, but it no longer controls significant parts of Syria. And also, the militant opposition to Assad is no longer in a position to overthrow and topple him. I mean, Vladimir Putin explicitly said yesterday that we have the upper hand in Syria. So they are no longer part of a viable process, at least if you want. The removal of Assad is no longer a viable military solution. So I think these issues have made these new sets of talks a important development.
Professor Moussaoui has been talking about the new realities, as he called it, but Mr. Li from Beijing, on that point, really much have changed. Yes, IS has been rid of to a certain extent, but the fate of Assad, which has always been one of the biggest issues among all parties that disagree with one another, has not gone away. Turkey, for example, has said, according to Washington Post reports, it has agreed that the people of Syria will be able to decide its future. Yet, it also said that given the previous circumstances, it's hard to see Assad still in the position. So it seems that there have been some diplomatic ways of saying the same thing as they used to be, Mr. Li. So much have changed?
Yes, I personally believe, the realities, the situation on the ground has changed a lot. Though, there is a differences among, different, political groups or the countries with regard to the fate of President Assad's future role. But generally speaking, everyone, it seems that, especially I think, the U.S. or some regional countries has accepted, the fact that, Assad at least is a part of the solution, though he also is a part of the problems. When
you say regional countries, exactly who are you referring to?
I think regional countries, of course, those countries from the Gulf states,
like
Saudi Arabia, like Qatar, and also UAE, those countries still in a very, very strong position against President Assad.
Yes, indeed, because, well, this meeting is taking place. Another meeting is taking place in Riyadh as well, bringing all the oppositions inside Syria together, even though they cannot be brought together because there are very strong divisions among them. And therefore, we have a good question, Mr. Tabarovsky. That is, who is going to play a bigger role? You see Saudi Arabia very active. You also see the West seem to withdraw a bit past a few months. But you never know, it's going to come back and impede the whole process.
Yes.
Again. So who is going to play a bigger role? That seems to be a crucial question. To bring all of them together or actually bring them further apart?
Well, it looks like Putin is trying to be a mediator between the both sides, because we know that he made telephone calls to Saudis, to Israel, to President Trump, So apparently he
and
tries...
you warmly received President Assad into
Yes,
Sochi.
yes, also. And I think that Putin will try to help President Assad as much as possible. You know, Putin is a very reliable partner. And
For whom?
to his friends,
I see.
to his partners. And it is true with his Russian friends and with his foreign friends. So he'll try to do his utmost to help Assad. But still his position is that Assad's future will be decided by the Syrian people.
Right.
So I think at this stage Putin is playing the major role.
Okay. And yet all powers are saying, let the Syrian people, no matter how abstract that concept is,
Yes.
to play a major role. That's why, Professor Musawi, in the coming month, in December, a so-called Syrian People's Congress is likely to be held in Sochi again. Of course, this time brought over by the three countries, Russia, Iran, and Turkey again, and yet we do not know who would appear there. And we do not know exactly what will be the result of it. So if we are talking about the Syrian people, will that meeting eventually, if it holds, going to decide exactly the fate of Syria's future? Professor Musawi.
Yes, so I think one of the very first interesting things about the Congress you mentioned is that these rounds of talks between Iran, Turkey, and Russia, the big absentee has been the United States. 10 years ago or 15 years ago, maybe even a couple of years ago, it would have been unimaginable for a major conference on the Middle East to take place without the presence of the United States, which has been a major player in the Middle East since the 1950s. And I think this shows the increasing role and influence of Russia, as well as the decline of the influence of the United States due to various reasons. Now, when the Congress actually takes place next month, or even perhaps even further than that, we'll have to see who gets to participate from the opposition and what will be the position of the United States. But I think at the end of the day, it should be the Syrian people who get to decide. These countries can only foster an environment that allows the Syrian people to make their own decisions.
Well, Professor Musawi, some would argue, well, maybe you are saying all of this only because President Assad is having an upper hand, only because Iran seems to be getting an upper hand as well, supporting President Assad. That's why you're saying putting the things back into the hands of the Syrian people. Some in the West might argue that way, Professor Musawi.
It's very true that Iran and Russia do have the upper hand currently in Syria, and I think that is the reason why Turkey has actually joined them. You know, that Turkey had a very tenuous relationship with Iran regarding Syria in the past few years. Nevertheless, they have joined Iran and Russia on this issue. Also, a very important issue in this regard is the Kurds, the YPG allied, U.S. allied forces in northeastern Syria have actually worried and concerned the Turks very much. And I think Turkey joining Iran and Russia has actually made this group actually stronger. So the opposition is, in fact, in a weak position. That is very true.
Having said all of this, this is what's going on within the three countries and also vis-a-vis Syria. But, Mr. Lee, as you may know, there were also investigations about exactly what happened in Syria concerning the civilian death by the United Nations. Only recently, the Russian ambassador to the UN said that investigation, quote, is dead, according to some media reports. So what exactly is the structure that we are looking at right now when we come to international community's efforts in dealing with the Syrian issue? International community, that's a very abstract word once again. Mr. Lee, help us to clarify.
I think, as well as, the international community, as well as the senior people, maybe, different people, different group, they may have different, interpretations or divine of, the terms of people or the community. But anyhow, I think, gradually people have been recognized. You know, this should be as soon as solution, the better for the Syrian people. If they are really serious concern about, you know, the face or the interests of the Syrian people.
All right, here comes the China's role. We are talking about from the Chinese capital. So what exactly is the role that China is likely to play? One of the 5 major, of course, powers of a Security Council. What is likely to be China's position? We have some previous votings in the Security Council. There are different views, different debates. Exactly how does China hold about the situation?
I think that China would play an increasingly important role in Syria issues. As we all know that, you know, the war against, you know, the ICC almost now is over. You know, the priority of, you know, in Syria is shifted from the violence or military into what we call the political process. And within the political process, another very important aspect is the rebuilding of the country, try to make, you know, the Syria more secure in order, you know, to get, you know, these refugees back at home. And so, you know, how to build, you know, for example, the daily necessities, and also important, you know, to push forward the whole national reconciliation. This is also very important. I personally believe China could play increasingly more important role in both in terms to help the Syrian people to rebuild their homes and also move forward for the national reconciliation.
That sounds like a beautiful picture. Before that picture becomes the reality, there's still a lot of work to do, I have to say. Professor Tuberculosis, you probably know this better for now. For
exactly.
Example, there are things uncertain. Let me just name 1 or 2 to you, Professor. One is, what's going to be the attitude from now on as things are getting ever clearer with the negotiations taking place in Saudi, from the United States, for example, or from the European Union, which have not been necessarily in the same line with Moscow. Secondly, what would be the so-called regional powers position as things evolve, including Saudi Arabia? And you may know the opposition is having a talk over there, and the Saudis are not hiding from supporting the opposition groups. And I mentioned groups because there are so many different divisions. So what would be these moving factors? What would that mean eventually for the negotiation?
You know, frankly speaking, I think we shouldn't care so much about their positions. If we think about all those factors and about the international community's reaction, then Syria will follow Libya's fate, Iraq's fate. Somebody has to go forward and make decisive steps. Right now, it's Russia, Iran, and Turkey. If we'll be succeeding, then we'll have much more support.
But whether you succeed or not, it also has to do with a lot of the other factors that might be supporting or against the going on meeting and process.
But, you know, the decisive role for the past few months was made by Russian planes, Persian soldiers, and, you know, things that are real. And then diplomats, journalists will come, discuss, and put forward new ideas. But right now, the fate of Syria is decided in the battlefield still. And I think America's reaction will depend on the outcome of these new initiatives. I'm sure they'll try to oppose it, to use as much effort to torpedo this conference and other measures. But still, together we are creating some sort of community of common destiny in the Middle East.
Okay. Interesting you're quoting that phrase. Mr. Musawi, coming from Iran, the other factors, how much impact will they eventually have on the ongoing process? Because we're talking about the next meeting very soon, early December. Very briefly from you, Professor Musawi.
Yes, I think other actors can have an impact, and I think the two most important actors that perhaps do not want to resolve the situation in Syria are actually Israel and Saudi Arabia. From Israel's perspective, the ongoing of the Syrian crisis is in their benefit because it is actually engaging both Iran and Hezbollah and actually turning away their attention from Israel. And because Iran and Hezbollah are their regional rivals, that's beneficial for them. From the Saudi Arabian perspective, under the direction of Mohammed bin Salman, they are actually trying to increase tensions in the Middle East due to various reasons. So we'll have to wait and see to see what happens in the next Congress.
And Mr. Lee, very briefly for you, what exactly going to happen? What shall we watch?
And first, the data of Syria's People's Conference has not yet been fixed yet.
Not.
The second very important factor, besides the three countries, U.S. now has the army in Syria. So those, countries have, their military troops or military presence in Syria will have a decisive, voice. So I personally believe the final political solution will be resolved if there is agreement between Russia and the United States.
We'll see how things would evolve on the battleground, and certainly, eventually, hopefully, in the negotiation rooms. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for helping us to clarify the latest situation and helping us to understand the potential. Hamed Musawi from Iran, Yuri Tavrovsky from Russia, and Li Guofu from China. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Really appreciate it. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on the program. A tuberculosis outbreak in middle school in Hunan has gripped the nation of China. Can the world succeed in eradicating this disease? Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. Tuberculosis outbreaks in Hunan has gripped public attention in China. Local authorities for discipline inspection are investigating, and some officials who hold the responsibility to the incident have already been fired. Take a look at what exactly happened.
We hear nightmares, one after another, and every day our classmates are sent to hospital. Nobody can understand the pain that we've suffered. We lag behind in our studies, and to lead a normal life has become a luxury for us. Those are the words from the diary of a tuberculosis patient, a student in her final at Taojiang No. 4 Middle School in Hunan Province. Her dream of entering a university this year seems beyond reach. As of last Thursday, 29 students at Taojiang have been diagnosed with tuberculosis, and there are 5 more suspected cases. A total of 72 students have received treatment or been put under observation, including 38 who've been given preventative medication. According to the local government, the outbreak started from August 19th, but no exact number of infected students was released. But some students claim there'd been cases of tuberculosis at school before then, and they've accused the school of hiding this information and not taking measures. The headmaster later responded that on the one hand, the local Center for Disease Prevention and Control hadn't asked the school to stop classes, and on the other hand, sending all students home would make it difficult to monitor the disease. The local government says 25 of the students are in the same class, and all those infected are expected to take the National College entrance exam soon. Tuberculosis is an infectious disease that generally affects the lungs. Experts say it takes at least 6 months to recover. So far, 50 students have recovered and been pronounced fit to resume study. The remaining 22 must undergo regular checkups until they're given a clean bill of health. Provincial authorities for discipline inspection are investigating whether there was dereliction of duty or misconduct by civil servants in the matter.
And for more on the tuberculosis outbreaks in central China's Hunan province, we are joined in our Beijing studio, Dr. Fabio Scano. Welcome back to our program, Coordinator for Disease Control and Prevention at WHO China Office. In Paris, we are joined by Dr. Eric Ding, epidemiologist and health economist from Harvard School of Public Health. I want to welcome both of you. First of all, Dr. Scano, how did it happen and why not just one outbreak but two outbreaks according to the latest report already?
Let me put it in perspective. The pillar of tuberculosis control is early diagnosis and to put patients on treatment as soon as possible, and to immediately screen what are the contacts. Basically are the people who came in contact with the cases. It's very basic. What we know about this outbreak is that there is an investigation ongoing that is looking not only into the outbreak but also into the response. And it's from various government, national authorities, government agencies. We are confident that the results of the investigation will inform the future step, in the sense that the system needs also to learn from itself on what action needs to be taken in the future for not having this happening again.
Of course, we're looking for the results of the investigation, whether who is responsible, how they spread, and why they spread so fast, because we also understand, besides the middle school that has been reported in our earlier backgrounder, there's another outbreak of more students coming from the vocational school in the same province that has been firmly already confirmed. Dr. Ding, while you were listening to the outbreaks in Hunan province, what came to your mind as an epidemiologist, and what do you think might be the common causes that has led to where we are today?
Yeah, I think tuberculosis is something that's very difficult to, at first, for regular non-clinicians to recognize, even for clinicians to recognize, especially since coughing is very common in the wintertime, you know, pollution and lots of other diseases and conditions give similar early signals of the same symptoms. So it's very hard to find, and especially in the rural villages, there's some studies that show only 5% to 1/3 of villages actually correctly diagnose TB and manage them, even if you do go to a clinic or doctor. So I think the management and early detection is very, very difficult, especially since most people ignore it, and especially among young people who don't want to take time off from school to prepare for their call.
Then, Dr. Scano, the question to be asked is, we've already got two outbreaks. Whether there's likely to be more outbreaks in that province or in the surrounding areas, it's a big concern. What is the way to prevent, and what is the way to know?
Well, I think that this case has brought attention to tuberculosis and to outbreaks of tuberculosis in settings like schools or also prisons, what is called congregate setting. And outbreaks per se, or cases of TB in school, are not unusual. I'm from Italy. When I was 16 in high school, there was a case of TB in my school. Everybody was screened. Fortunately, nobody felt sick. The patient, the student, was put on treatment and then came back to school. So it's really a multi-sectorial response to look into the situation and keep the alert always high, because it can happen also everywhere. But the issue is, what is the response? And I think that this is a lesson learned for the future.
And whether the response is speedy enough.
And whether the response is speedy enough.
Exactly. Dr. Ding, of course, the outbreaks of tuberculosis really ring a bell to many people, alarm, shall I say, because people still remember very clearly about the SARS outbreak in China almost a decade ago now. And yet that has left people with a lot of concerns at the time. So the question is, how can the health system always improve itself? Not about being cautious about one outbreak, but always on alert. That's exactly the role of the CDC, many would argue. So, Dr. Ding, what is the way to do it?
I think people, first of all, have to be proactive in trying to identify these symptoms and conditions and not be afraid to shut down entire schools if necessary. Because oftentimes local principals and even local hospitals are hesitant to create a quarantine or to create a mass scare because of economic interests or other political interests. But I think in public health, people should be rewarded. That says, even if you raise the early alarm bell and it's false alarm, that's actually better than not raising any alarm and creating an epidemic. And so I think we have to change the culture, because people right now, they don't really even, doctors in these rural villages, they don't even correctly prescribe the right antibiotic medicine. They don't correctly order chest x-ray. I think people need to realize public health priority is way more important than a Gaokao exam, way more important than economic interests. And if we put public health and quarantine and mass testing priority first, I think we can control it and not have another outbreak every few years.
That's true. Dr. Scano, there's another issue that people have been asking, that is, what about the drugs that's needed for the treatment of tuberculosis? There have been some media reports suggesting some of the low-cost drugs have not been popular with manufacturers. Rather, only the imported ones, which are tending to be more expensive, or some of the more expensive local-made drugs. Dr. Scano, what do you make of the latest situation regarding that to treat tuberculosis?
I think that to treat tuberculosis, they are the right drugs, and it's a paramount importance for the doctors to follow the standardized guidelines that are issued by the government and not taking necessarily individual choices. Because what really worked for TB around the world and in China since the 90s is a standardized treatment approach. In fact, over the last 20 years, the rates of tuberculosis have been coming down in the country, and the situation is much better than what it used to be 20 years ago. If we start misusing the drugs, the result is multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. That is much more difficult to treat, and it's a much bigger burden not only on the patients but also on their families. So really, a lot of attention and also guidance is on following standardized treatment.
Dr. Ding, as you can see from Dr. Scano's explanation, China has very clearly have guidelines regarding how to prevent and treat tuberculosis. And yet, in an outbreak like this, people are still getting very concerned. In terms of the drugs,
well,
what do you think the way?
Guidelines. Yeah, I think the drugs, first of all, 1/3 of all multi-drug resistant TB occurs in China. 1/3 of all the multi-drug resistant TB in the world occur in China. And that's an incredible amount. And if you actually test the doctors on surveys, they prescribe correctly on the survey tests. But in the actual practice, in some of these studies in these rural villages, people give out, unrelated, drugs like candy. And so I think it's not just making sure having the correct guidelines, but making sure you enforce these guidelines at the local level to not have more multi-drug resistant TB, because those are the most dangerous TB. And if multi-drug resistant TB gets out, it's almost impossible to stop.
All over the world, gentlemen, we have 900,000 outbreaks. This is a disease that can be, in a way, prevented and also can certainly be treated after all. How long are we going to see this disease still continue, particularly in developing countries and emerging economies? There are enormous amount of efforts made all over the world to eradicate it. However, it is still there. Dr. Scano.
You're right. It actually has been with humanity for thousands of years. What is a good news, I think, is that we should share with the public is that Last week, there's been one of the highest political commitment for tuberculosis, and President Putin opened a meeting, a ministerial meeting in Moscow, specific on tuberculosis with the leadership around the world, and we are happy that also the Minister of Health from China attended the meeting, and ended up with a Moscow Declaration that it's a bold multi-sectorial response to end TB by 2030. So there is a target. And what is needed, it's really a political commitment to end the last miles of this marathon, to really end TB in the world.
Dr. Ding, is that last mile easy?
It's not easy at all, because the solution to TB is not just quarantine, not just drugs, but actually better nutrition. And better nutrition is basically a measure of economic development. And micronutrient deficiency, which occurs not just in Africa, in India, but also in China, in rural villages, I think that's actually one of the most important fundamental things. You cannot just use drugs and use quarantine to solve TB. You actually have to solve the entire healthcare ecosystem, starting with nutrition.
We see China's economy has been taking off, gentlemen. We see the lives of people and the living standards have really been improved. And yet, some of the long-stay disease that's suffered by the public in a much worse economic situation are still with the Chinese public these days. Dr. Scano, you've been here in China for really quite some time. How do you make of this division that we seem to have, or conflict in a way, that Chinese President Xi Jinping was even talking about at the 19th Party Congress, you know, the demand for better life from the public and the insufficient and unbalanced development of the country. How much is that need to be done in order to get rid of tuberculosis? And that is only one of those examples regarding health. Dr. Scano.
I think that the challenge and the goal of the health reform, that is one of the biggest program of any government in the world, is exactly to bring care to everybody in China, not only in the major cities, but in every corner. TB is a problem in China, but if you look at the numbers per population, they're not so high, because there is a lot of inequities between urban and rural areas. So, since there is a lot of emphasis on the health reform, it would be very good if also tuberculosis, which is in every corner of the country, could benefit from more investment in patients accessing care without shouldering also financial hardship. That is another issue that is linked with tuberculosis.
Dr. Ding, agree with that?
Absolutely agree, but I think the overall picture is more economic development, and not just pure economic development for money and economy and factory's sake, but actually health care and correct delivery of nutrition to these rural villages, where that's actually where a lot of these epidemics start, not in the urban cities. So I think more of the focus on the inequality and more of the economic whole economy development, not just building more factories and chasing economics per se.
Dr. Scano, it is not the first time that you see that some of the officials in charge or related to health scares actually are being held responsible. This time too, some have already been fired or sacked at the moment. But will this be the ultimate way to make sure that system would work well and work as it plans to be?
I think what is important is that the system learns from itself on the response. Then I don't comment directly on whether a person should be removed from the seat or not, because this is a part of the national authority's responsibility. But what's really crucial is to understand not only what worked and what didn't work, but also how to communicate the results to the population, because what we are seeing now is to associate TB with stigma and discrimination. And this goes against a public health approach, because people, they don't access care or diagnosis because they are concerned about being stigmatized. And this plays really against what we want, that is people accessing the health services if they need it.
Dr. Ding?
I think firing government officials and schools teachers is not the solution. You need, as we know, carrots work better than sticks. So I think what we should actually have is perhaps a reward system for those who report early cases, that even if it's false positive, I think having this carrot approach is way more better than using the stick approach of trying to scare and fire people who do not adhere afterwards after an epidemic happens.
Well,
so I think prevention and proactivism is key.
Probably carrots and sticks both has to be used. But for now, I want to thank both of you, Fabio Scano and Eric Ding, for being with us. All the best to the children in the middle school in some of the schools that have experienced outbreaks. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.